Hey there, everyone. That sexy nerd is back again. And what are we watching today? We are watching a special companion piece that I thought would be interesting. Now, I still don't have 2,000 views for the Hitler video, the History Buffs Hitler video, which again, I have promised that I would actually react to the movie on the channel. And, hopefully you guys watch that when it gets to 2,000 views. And I thought, I came across this video from this channel called FlashBack History, which is great stuff. Like, I love this guy. And again, I'm sorry I don't call out a lot of people when I do their videos, and I really should, honestly. And because these people do great work, and I love reacting to their stuff. And, just YouTube's a great place, ain't it? But anyway, this guy, Flashback History, basically did the Battle of Berlin. And basically that's what the whole episode of History Buffs was. But we didn't see the actual battle or hear about the really nasty stuff. And warning, this guy is known for describing very terrible and horrible things. He's already gone over the Nanking Massacre, the just many of history's like darkest moments. And I find his channel very fascinating. But this is just a trial run. See if it's okay on YouTube. See if I don't get in trouble on YouTube. But yeah, I'm really excited to watch this companion piece on the Battle of Berlin. Basically it's the other side. Where while Hitler wasn't. Oh, I don't know. Maybe it was when Hitler was in the bunker. I don't know. About to watch the video. So why don't we just get to it? And remember, please smash that like button if you want to see more sexy and nerdy content, and subscribe if you think I deserve it. And remember, sign up for my Patreon for all my latest reactions to all my latest videos. And let's do this thing, y'all. Yeah, see? That is exactly why I had to do that.
It's May 1945. We're in Berlin, the capital of the fallen Nazi Reich. 17-year-old Gerda Kürnchen huddles with her family and neighbours, cowering into silence on the floor of their bunker. They haven't heard a gunshot for a while. Perhaps it's all over. Perhaps they're safe now. But then, the hammering of rifle butts on the door. Gerda's blood runs cold as the thuds grow louder. The door flexes and bows, then shatters altogether. As their eyes adjust to the blinding light streaming in from outside, Soviet soldiers burst through the door. They speak little German, just enough to let the occupants know what they're here for. Women, they say. Women come. One of Gerda's neighbours is the first to be taken outside.
Oh boy.
From within the bunker, they hear the screams as she is horrifically assaulted. The soldiers laugh and crack jokes as they decide who will be next. But amid this grim distraction, Gerda and her family make a decision. They decide they'll run for it. Sprinting beyond the door, Gerda sees the outside world for the first time in days. But it's not like how she remembers.
Wow.
Corpses are strewn everywhere, both German and Russian.
Ooh.
But the family must keep going. Weak from hunger and traumatized by what they see around them, they keep on running. Somehow, they make it back to the home they'd fled days before. Thinking quickly, Gerda's father hides the family in the cellar, covering the trapdoor with rugs, blankets, anything else he can find. It won't be enough. As Gerda herself tells us, I prefer not to talk about what happened when the Russians arrived at our house and discovered us, because it's too painful. Gerda's story is a horrifying reminder of the brutality of war. It shows how, all too often, it's the ordinary people who must bear its brunt, innocent civilians who experience the full, unyielding depravity.
And I know what you guys are gonna say, that I'm gonna be, or you guys are gonna think that, like I was in the Hitler video, I was very critical of the German people for electing Hitler, because yes, they did put him in power. They didn't deserve all this, though. I mean, it's kind of horrible what the Soviets did and what they continued to do for years. But it wasn't undeserved, at least by the military. It just sucks that the people have to suffer for it. It's the unfortunate circumstances, especially of World War II, and hopefully we don't have to experience things like these, but we're inching ever closer to that, and I really hope that doesn't happen.
But Goethe's story is more than just brutal, it's needless. By the spring of 1945, Germany's race was run. Hitler's delusional scheme for a racially pure empire stretching from the Atlantic to Vladivostok had evaporated into pure fantasy.
Bye-bye.
As Allied troops advanced from the west, south and east, Germany was squeezed in a vice from which they couldn't escape.
Wow.
There was no way back. It was all over. And yet Hitler hung on until the very end. He maintained his grip on power
Did he?
for as long as he could.
Yeah.
He sent his soldiers to their deaths. He let his civilians experience every abject misery in their own streets.
This is a pathetic, silly little man with a silly little mustache.
Then, as Berlin teetered on the edge of capitulation, he abandoned his capital to its fate. He took his own life and left behind hundreds of thousands of Berliners to pay the price for his crimes.
There you go.
This is the story of how we got here. How we got to...
She was married?
Kernchen and her family pleading for their lives on the floor of a Berlin basement. This is the story of the fall of Berlin.
Oh, this is going to be fun, isn't it?
As Soviet troops advanced on Berlin in April 16th...
Is there a little boy there?
They found their way blocked. Commanding the first Belarusian front, Marshal Zhukov was supposed to be leading the charge in the centre, driving forwards on Berlin from the east. But in his way were the Silo Heights. This area of strategic high ground on the approach to Berlin was defended by more than 112,000 men. For days, these troops held off a Soviet force almost 10 times its size. Their grit and determination is staggering this late in the day. They were willing to lay down their lives in a battle they couldn't possibly win. But as Marshal Vasily Chuikov and his 8th Guards army floundered on the boggy plain beneath the heights, his superior, Zhukov, began to panic. An enraged Stalin had told Zhukov to pull his finger out and get a move on. His great rival, Marshal Ivan Konev, was making rapid progress to the south, racing ahead with his first Ukrainian front. Rather than galvanizing his most prized marshals, Stalin had decided to play them off against one another. Stalin's manipulation worked.
And again, I remember there was a commenter on one of on there, because again, I really went off on the German people, and they're like, you know, what did you think about Joseph Stalin? And basically, and I'm like, oh, just as big of a jackass, just as big of an asshole. And honestly, for the most part, he unfortunately, but that usually happens in Russia, he got away with most of it. Yeah, he eventually ended up dying in a very humiliating way and being left alone for a cerebral hemorrhage, but that wasn't enough pain. That it didn't even come close to the pain that he inflicted on his own frickin' people, much less others across his occupied territories. Let's not forget that either. And the Germans. Two wrongs honestly don't make a right. But at the same time, how the hell can you even blame them for being so cruel to the Germans? The Germans started the war. And they treated them like worse than trash. At least trash gets some sort of respect. Or, you know, at least okay to be thrown out. Not, these people were treated worse than trash. And it's sad.
Zhukov pushed on, driving his Stalin's manipulation worked. Zhukov pushed on, driving his soldiers up onto the heights in the hope that brute force would win the day. And it did. Eventually. Almost 4 days later, and with more than 33,000 dead, the Soviets took the heights. By April 19th, the so-called gates to Berlin were wide open. Now, the Soviets advanced
Wow.
en masse.
That's a fantastic
To the south,
photo.
the First Ukrainian Front raced through its objectives as the landscape of the eastern German frontier burned. Konev's tanks and infantry tore across the countryside. Meeting only scant resistance, they secured Cottbus and Lublin on Berlin's south flank before wheeling towards Ketzin in the west. In the north and east, Zhukov's first Belarusian front were on the move too. By April 21st, the encirclement was almost complete. The survivors of Silo were now streaming back into Berlin and preparing new defensive lines ahead of the coming assault. But morale was devastatingly low. Soviet air power and artillery pummeled the highways. Wounded soldiers collapsed and died out on the road. Even relatively minor injuries were a death sentence for those retreating soldiers. Inside the city, however, life continued with a semblance of normality. Civilians received their rations, which were now just 200 grams of bread, 36 grams of meat, and 18 grams of lard per person. Newspapers were still circulating. The citizens of a city on the edge were still just about connected to the outside world. But as Soviet forces began to close in on the city's outskirts, they turned their artillery on Berlin itself.
Don't you just love those assholes? They're still coming up with like, they're still coming up with like anti-Jewish sentiment when their city is literally falling around them. It's like, those damn Jews! Like, what the hell?
Was in on the city's outskirts, they turned their artillery on Berlin itself. From April 22nd onwards, the capital was cut off. Civilians waiting in line for rations were annihilated beneath the bombardment. Those who did reach the front of those queues found that there was nothing left. So the starving went from house to house in a desperate search for food. Shops and storehouses were raided as Berliners struggled to scratch out survival. By now, the city was being hammered into oblivion by artillery.
Looks like Ukraine right now.
And houses offered little protection.
Yeah.
Many sought shelter within the city's flak towers, but these were targets for the Soviet guns. Civilians were killed where they sheltered. But these civvies weren't alone in the city. A ragtag assortment of troops still stood between the Red Army and their prize. Around 45,000 Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS troops were tasked with holding Berlin. These largely came from other units that had been shattered by fighting elsewhere and then fallen back and reorganized in the city. Foreign SS brigades were also present, and some were quite effective. The French SS Charlemagne division knew they would be executed if they returned to their homeland. They were content to fight to the end in Berlin. They knew that they might as well make the streets of the city their grave as anywhere else. The same applied to the...
You know, honestly, if they made a movie about, like, the people that Germany kidnapped and forced to be their soldiers, and they would have to make the journey home or something like that, that would be a fantastic story. I would wonder, is there anything like that, or I don't know. What do you guys think?
Nordland division of Nazi troops from Scandinavia and the 50 British Nazis of the Free Corps all knew they must fight till the death and take as many Soviets down with them as they could. Other defenders included the now famous Hitlerjugend and Volkssturm. The Hitlerjugend were youth brigades. They were supposed to be aged 14 and up, but many were much younger.
I would imagine.
Volkssturm was basically anyone else not yet enlisted in the army. Many were the elderly veterans of the First World War. Officers placed little faith in these units and called them casserole because they were made up of, quote, old meat and green vegetables.
What assholes.
All in all, perhaps 85,000 German troops stood against the around 500,000 Soviet soldiers now prizing into Berlin.
I love how these people, again, are treating others like jackasses, again, while they're literally facing the apocalypse.
But even this 85,000 was dwindling. Many troops now tried to desert, and those who were caught were made examples of. One Berliner remembered seeing a deserter hanged from a motorway bridge. Local children amused themselves by batting the swinging corpse back and forth.
Jesus.
This is a common theme from the fall of Berlin. Desperate to keep their army together, German commanders grew increasingly ruthless, spurred on by a pamphlet issued by Hitler in his final days. Quote, "Anyone who proposes or even approves of measures detrimental to our power or resilience is a traitor. He is to be shot or hanged immediately."
And then Himmler came along.
Werner Eckart was only a child as the Soviet forces approached. He remembered how soldiers who attached white bands to their arms in an attempt to surrender were executed. Quote, "I saw them hanging there. For one of them, I even had to write a sign saying, 'I am a coward. I wanted to deliver the German Reich to communism.'"
Oh boy.
Civilians met the same fate. Friedrich Schwarz attempted to raise a white flag from his window on Zionskirchplatz. He was hanged. Meanwhile, out on the approaches to Berlin, the Soviets began liberating prison camps. At Potsdam, Camp Commandant SS Lieutenant Colonel Döberke understood that all was lost, but he hesitated when ordered to shoot the inmates.
Ooh.
Sensing the opportunities to save themselves, the inmates signed a document that affirmed Döberke's generosity and mercy. In a rare moment of sanity from one of Berlin's commanders, and probably aware that such a document might just save him from the hangman's rope after the war, he unlocked the gates and abandoned the camp. The inmates were overjoyed until their supposed saviors arrived. Any Soviet prisoners were dismayed to be handed rifles and sent off to the front.
What?
Most of the female prisoners were subjected to horrifying acts of abuse by the very people who were supposed to be liberating them. On April 20...
Wait a minute. I always thought that Stalin was like, yo, get to the gulags. Oh, actually, yeah, the war's not over yet, technically. But that's terrible. They immediately released these prisoners and put them into the front? Can you imagine that? Suffering completely as a prisoner, being sick, God knows what you have done, and then they're like, go, take rifle and shoot more Germans. It's a real damn shame. And especially, again, it's like, it's Russia, man. Russia is so brutal. Ugh.
27th, with the Soviets now moving into the inner suburbs, the Nazi forces still in the city made preparations for their last stand. Despite the hopelessness of the situation, Hitlerjugend and Volksturm soldiers proved their disparaging officers dead wrong. Even faced with such a hopeless task, they showed themselves to be brave, committed, even fairly effective. At Friedrichsfeld, 770 men of the 315th Simonstadt Battalion had been battling the Red Army since April 21st and was still holding out. These soldiers were largely World War I veterans who'd served as factory workers throughout most of the Second World War. Courageous, experienced, and relatively fit, the Simonstadt would hold out right until the end. When they surrendered on May 2nd, they had just 50 rifles left between them. Less than one firearm per 10 men. Surprisingly, some of the Jugend divisions were also quite experienced. The 12th SS Panzer Division, for example, had fought at Normandy the previous summer and suffered enormous casualties. Those who remained were battle-hardened and ideologically obsessive. They fought ferociously in Berlin. This wasn't the case for all.
Look at those kids right there. Look at those kids right there. They're tiny. They're barely, like, look at them. They look like they're, they don't even look like they're 10 years old, these kids.
However, some youths were barely even big enough to hold a gun. An eyewitness account from Berlin's inner suburbs tells of finding a child weeping in the street, wearing a German uniform many sizes too big for him. Despite the danger, the witness left her home and ran across the street to the poor child. Through his tears, he told her of his orders. He'd been instructed to lie in wait with his grenade. When he spotted a Soviet tank, his responsibility was to throw himself under it and blow it up. The witness left the child there. She knew that he would be hanged as a deserter if she told him to run. And she also knew that she and her entire family would be shot if they tried to shelter him. But despite a few experienced units and a bit of ideological fanaticism, the Germans knew they were outmatched in terms of numbers, equipment, rations, everything. However, despite the overwhelming odds, the Soviet guns had pulverized the city. Berlin was now a bombed-out labyrinth with danger at every corner. The Germans would use this to their advantage. Perhaps they could turn Berlin into another Stalingrad. They deployed snipers and gunners on the rooftops, knowing that Soviet tank guns couldn't reach them there. Down below, they built anti-tank nests in cellars, destroying Soviet armor in the street and creating choke points for the advanced.
Those British soldiers?
Sometimes. This was seriously effective. At the Halensee Bridge, the Charlemagne SS and a collection of the Jugend were able to halt the Soviet advance for 2 days.
Oh.
Big picture, though, the Soviets were still making gains. After Stalingrad, the Red Army knew how to conduct urban warfare too. They were savvy in picking their targets. Berlin was riddled with bunkers and tunnels, each packed with soldiers waiting to lure their enemy into a bloody subterranean struggle. Soviet troops paid little heed to this tempting fight. They simply sealed the tunnels, trapping the soldiers inside, and continued moving above ground. They then took Tempelhof Airport on April 27th and crossed the Landwehr Canal the same day. By the 28th, the Red Army had neutralized all but 10,000 German troops. These last defenders were now corralled into a strip 9 miles by 3 miles in the city centre. They needed relief. A counter-attack from General Volta-Venk's XX Corps on the 28th offered hope, but that too failed. A Soviet victory was now only a matter of time, so the Red Army commanders turned their attention to symbolic targets. The Reichstag building had barely been used by the Nazis since its burning in 1933, but it was an important building all the same. This was where the Soviets would raise their flag. German troops, even at this late in the hour, would do anything to stop them. Taking this building was a nightmare. A great trench in the adjoining Königsplatz was filled with water, making progress difficult. Even worse, the flak tower at the Berlin Zoo still lay in German hands and maintained a steady fire upon the advancing troops. It took the Soviets more than 14 hours to blast their way into the Reichstag. Once inside, they were met with hell on earth, as desperate German defenders did anything they could to repulse their assailants. At close quarters, soldiers fought with fists, knives, clubs, chair legs, anything they could find.
Jeez.
In this melee, 2 Soviet sergeants managed to sprint to the roof, carrying the red Soviet flag. They dashed across the building's rooftop, hastily erected their flag, and dashed back down again. The Soviet flag now flew above the Reichstag, but men were still dying on the floors below. If you think this sounds a little different to the much publicised photograph of the flag flying above the vehicles and troops calmly massed below, that's because it is different. Yevgeny Keldy's famous image was of a reenactment, staged several days later.
Really?
While the battle continued to rage in the Reichstag, though, Hitler had finally given up hope. Now he prepared one last betrayal for all the people who had fallen under his spell. At 2:30 in the afternoon on April 30th, Hitler and Eva Braun, now Ava Hitler, after a hasty wedding ceremony, entered a private study in his bunker. Sometime later, Hitler's valet, Heinz Linie, and Martin Bormann entered the study together and found both dead. Hitler had shot himself. Braun died from cyanide poisoning. So, Hitler was gone. He would never face justice for his crimes, and he would never have to show his face to the German people who were now dying in their thousands.
Coward!
In his name.
Coward! Coward!
All that was left was to dispose of his corpse.
Just like Trump, an utter friggin' coward.
This required petrol, but there's a problem. There wasn't any.
What?
SS men were detailed with venturing out into the war-torn streets to siphon off fuel from nearby cars, cobbling together enough to torch Hitler and Eva Braun. This was what it came to. The greedy expansion into Russia was supposed to unlock untold natural resources, transforming Germany into an unstoppable power.
But it didn't work.
Now, it was the Russians in Germany's backyard, and there was barely enough petrol left over to burn 2 measly corpses. Nonetheless, the battle raged on. As April became May, many soldiers began coming to their senses. Hearing that the Americans were approaching to the west, some attempted to save themselves by reaching them and surrendering. Streaming across the Charlottenburg Bridge, heading west, most were cut down by raking Soviet machine gun fire. Very few of them actually made it. Over at the Berlin Zoo, the flak tower that had been such a
Jeez.
thorn in the side of the Soviets was
Gone.
still firing.
What?
And they kept on firing until
Whoa.
they received the order from General Helmut Weidling. Every hour you keep on fighting prolongs the suffering of the civilians in Berlin and of our wounded. Together with the Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet forces, I order you to stop fighting immediately.
Wow.
Weidling, General of Artillery, former district commandant in the defense of Berlin. Finally, on May 2nd, 350 SS men ambled down from the tower with their hands in the air and handed themselves over to whatever the Soviets had in store for them. At 8:23 in the morning, Weidling had surrendered to Chuikov. The Battle of Berlin was over. The war in Europe was over.
Done.
But the suffering of Berlin's civilians was far from it.
Oof.
Soviet soldiers now occupied the city, and at the end of a long war that had almost seen the total destruction of their country and people, many were in the mood for revenge. And Germany had just left herself toothless to resist any abuse that may follow. In the words of historian Anthony Beaver, calls to avenge the motherland, violated by the Wehrmacht's invasion, had given the idea that almost any cruelty would be allowed. While most
Oh boy, here we go.
the Soviets, some welcomed them with open arms, particularly those who'd hidden their own communist sympathies. Dorothea von Schwannenflügel described how the couple in the home next door to hers stood in their front yard to wave and cheer the Soviets as they passed. Our suspicion that they were communists had been right all along, but they must have been out of their minds to openly proclaim their brotherhood like that. That night, a detachment of Soviet soldiers returned. From their own property, Dorothea and her family listened to what happened next. We heard what sounded like a terrible orgy, with women screaming for help, many shrieking at the same time. Some of the Soviets trampled through our garden and banged their rifle butts on our doors in an attempt to break in. Thank goodness for our sturdy wooden doors. The first wave of Soviet troops were battle-hardened frontline veterans. They were ruthless killers, but maintained a sense of soldierly discipline. Gerda Kernchen was just a teenager when Berlin fell. She remembered how the frontline troops would shoot every man that they saw, both old and young, but left the women alone. It was the next wave who unleashed hell upon the populace, and upon women in particular. It was the second echelon who were the worst. They went through all the houses and took whatever they wanted. We heard from Gerda early in this video, so we know that she herself experienced this horror firsthand. Gerda did survive, but what she and her family were subjected to when they were captured, we can't know. Even decades later, it was too painful for her to share. It was, however, tragically commonplace. Some of the details of these crimes are too extreme to mention on YouTube, but a fully uncensored version of the video is available on our Patreon. The journalist Marta Hillers wrote about her own experiences of multiple assaults in those months. She described how women had no way to protect themselves from the attentions of the soldiers. From Marta's book, when the woman and her neighbours go to a Soviet commander to complain and to seek his aid, he merely laughs.
Yeah.
Berlin's women also found no sympathy from female Soviet personnel, as
No.
Anthony Beaver again tells us. Even many young women soldiers and medical staff in the Red Army didn't appear to disapprove.
Why would they?
A number seemed to find it amusing. Several German women recorded how Soviet servicewomen watched and laughed when they were violated.
Ew.
Beaver also gives us a quote from a 21-year-old female servicewoman in the Soviet Reconnaissance Department. Our soldiers' behaviour towards Germans, particularly German women, is absolutely correct. With no protection from commanders, some women tried to take matters into their own hands. They decided that going through the charade of a romantic liaison with just one man would be better than suffering repeated assaults from many others. In the words of Marta Hillers, it was best to, quote, find a single wolf to keep away the pack.
Oof.
In many cases, it was only the family members of victims who tried to protect women in Berlin. A letter from a Berlin resident remembers the case of 13-year-old Dieter Saal. He threw himself with flailing fists at a Russian who was sexually assaulting his mother in front of him.
Oh no.
He didn't succeed in anything, except getting himself shot. Some children became targets of this kind of violence themselves. Hanna Lorena was only 12 years old when she was, in her own words, battered and defiled by Stalin's soldiers. She was then thrown from a window, resulting in a spinal fracture that gave her severe pain throughout her life.
Oh!
She did survive her ordeal, marrying future German Chancellor Helmut Kohl in 1960. She would later found the curatorium ZNS Foundation to support those with spinal injuries. In 2001, she tragically took her own life. Even after the surrender, the suffering of Berliners continued.
Oh.
Historian Chris Bellamy believes that this kind of mass violation continued almost unabated until May the 8th, when Soviet commanders finally tried to bring this under control. For months afterwards, Berliners experienced dire conditions. That June, most were barely receiving enough daily rations to survive, while more than 1 million were left homeless. In the end, the battle for Berlin was a needless waste of life on both sides. More than 80,000 Soviet troops died across the 2-week campaign, and at least 100,000 German soldiers were killed, and probably many more than this. 125,000 German civilians perished. And all, basically, for nothing. German lives were lost in the defense of a lost cause. Soviet lives were also sacrificed in pursuing a victory that they'd already achieved long before. All this needless bloodshed left an indelible stain upon the city and its population, made worse by the horrific treatment received by the survivors. By some accounts, as many as 100,000 women were victims of unspeakable abuse after the fall of Berlin, and perhaps 10% were killed during their ordeal. While some historians disagree on the exact numbers, there's a consensus that this was happening on a widespread scale across the city in its final days and beyond. And yet, the topic remains, somehow, contentious. In Russia, the works of Antony Beevor and others are banned.
Really?
Reasoning? They, quote, promote stereotypes formed during the Third Reich. Well, that's the official directive.
Oh.
And of course, in history forums and in the comment sections across the internet, perhaps even the comment section in this video, there is a startling lack of sympathy for the victims. As one commentator said, for their support of the Nazis, the deprivations that came as a consequence remain as understandable and not troublesome. They deserved far worse than they received.
Not all of
But there
them.
are some real problems with this view. It's certainly true that Nazi forces committed gross atrocities in
Yes,
the Soviet
the
Union
soldiers.
in the years leading up to the
The
battle.
soldiers, and yes, some of the vile civilians who conducted in hate and really supported the Nazis. The innocent ones, though, the people who were just there, living their lives, trying to scratch out a living, trying to make their lives better. No, they didn't deserve that.
Hitler himself said the war against the Soviet Union would be one of extermination. Summary executions and mass killings were permitted, sometimes even encouraged, at the discretion of officers. And this wasn't limited to political violence or the murder of POWs. This extended to just civilians as well. An obsession with supposed Judeo-Bolshevism fueled murder on a horrific scale in the USSR, and the invasion effectively became an extension of Holocaust doctrine. That same abuse that occurred in Berlin was also widespread in Eastern Europe, this time by German soldiers advancing east. Russian women, for instance, would ultimately birth more than 1 million children sired by German fathers. The overwhelming majority of these births were the result of coercion,
Yes.
intimidation, or simply brute physical force. It made sense that Soviet troops fostered a profound hatred for the Germans they found in Berlin and elsewhere. Nazis had offered them no quarter, so they would offer none in return. It's also probable that many of the victims were avowed Nazis themselves, even though they would have had no part in the invasion of the USSR. While Berlin was traditionally a socialist city and had not embraced Nazi ideology to the same extent as other strongholds of fascism, large numbers of the population would have been supporters of the Third Reich.
Yes.
But whether some people were complicit in Nazi atrocities or not, or whether some people actively supported those atrocities or not, is yet to be determined. It remains a is irrelevant. Abuse and violation of the worst kinds were used as a weapon in the fall of Berlin, and this cannot be justified. These were acts of misogyny and hatred, not acts of war or politics.
But again, the Germans did the same thing, so what can you say there? Because it really is. It's a really tough subject to really go over. It's like, who do you really blame? I mean, honestly, the Germans, yes, got what they deserved. I don't know. It's really, it's honestly hard. Yes, they got what they deserved. But man, it's just really hard to say. And I mean, let me know in the comments, what do you guys think? I mean, I know there are going to be a lot of people who are on the right who are going to be like, oh, the Germans, the Nazis, oh, they were so brutalized by these people. But at the same time, ignoring what happened to the Russians. It's a really hard one. Think about it.
And the way in which victims were selected proves this. When Soviet troops shone flashlights over the faces of terrified women, they were not assessing who was the most deserving of punishment,
no.
Who was most likely a supporter of the Third Reich.
No.
What they were looking for were the prettiest women, the ones they found most desirable.
Yes.
And so, with this final act of cruelty, a conflict that was already defined by unimaginable human suffering on an unprecedented scale, finally ended. The war in Europe was put to bed. The closing note was one of more pointless acts of dehumanizing brutality.
Might quite possibly be the most disturbing and genuinely upsetting video I've had to watch for the channel. Again, I know I've said a lot of these things, but again, I really wish it was Hitler who was the one to suffer, not the German people, you know. But at the same time, at least they're better now. I mean, it's just a lot. It's really a lot. What can you say? And how can you even really condemn the Russians for really wanting revenge, especially for what the Germans did? They did far worse. The Germans did far worse to the Russians than the Russians did to them at the end of the day. They only did that to their city. Yeah, they occupied them, but the things that they did to the Russians, the horrible things. I mean, there is a movie called Come and See where they take an entire village and lock them all into a barn. Women and children, all children, men and everything, just locked up in a barn. They start shooting it, and then they eventually set it on fire while they laugh. And it's the face of evil right there. And after Russians seeing that, like, what the hell? How the hell could you really condemn them for feeling the way they feel? And it's a really tough, pill to swallow, because at the end of the day, is violence justified? Is this violence justified? I guess we'll never know. But anyway, please hug your family, tell your mother you love her, and please smash that like button if you want to see more sexy and nerdy content, and subscribe if you think I deserve it. And remember, sign up for my Patreon for all my latest reactions to my latest videos. And I'll see you on the next episode.